Helen, my best friend, and I were driving our SUV through the Olympic Forest in Washington. Tonight, the rain was pouring down, reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. The windshield was covered with rainwater, and the wipers were working non-stop to help us see the wet, muddy path before us. The Olympic Forest is renowned for its mystique and the eerie stories passed down through generations, and tonight, it felt like we were immersed in one of those tales. "Be careful, I think we're approaching a tricky section," Helen said, her eyes focused on the map. Her long brown hair was draped down, with a few strands clinging damply to her face. "Don't worry, I'll go slow. By the way, are you sure we're on the right track?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite my growing anxiety. "Absolutely, trust me. I've studied the route thoroughly," Helen replied with a warm smile, her confident gaze reassuring me. Helen is a vibrant person, always knowing how to make every moment enjoyable. We met nearly a year ago when I moved into the suburban apartment we now share. Initially, I didn't have many friends and felt quite lonely, but Helen appeared like a guiding light, making me feel warm and welcomed. We quickly became best friends. An unforgettable memory was when we went camping by Crescent Lake, also in the Olympic Forest. That night, it rained heavily, and we had to sleep in a tent with the rain falling like a sad melody. Helen told me funny stories to ease my fear of the dark and the strange noises around us. "Remember the camping trip at Crescent Lake? It rained like this then, too," Helen laughed, recalling the old memory. "Of course, I remember. You told those silly stories to keep me from being scared," I replied, feeling a bit more relaxed. "Yeah, but this time we don't have a tent. We need to find shelter before it gets completely dark," Helen reminded me, her tone more serious. Back to the present, our SUV navigated through the rugged road, and the headlights illuminated the tall trees on either side. Helen turned on the radio, but only static filled the air, making the inside of the car feel even more silent and tense. I tried to keep a firm grip on the wheel, but a part of my mind couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious stories of this forest. Could tonight be the night we encounter something inexplicable? "I'm a bit worried, but having you here makes me feel much better," I admitted, glancing at Helen. "Don't worry, we'll get through this. Remember, we've faced worse things before," Helen said, squeezing my hand for a moment before letting go, the warmth of her touch giving me confidence. Those thoughts sent chills down my spine, but Helen's presence next to me reassured me. No matter what happens, I knew we would face it together, just like we had in previous adventures, and perhaps it was this very bond that made our relationship so special and unbreakable. We continued to venture deeper into the Olympic Forest. The rain was relentless, heavy, and unyielding. The sound of the SUV's engine mixed with the rain, creating a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. The limited visibility due to the thick sheets of rain forced me to strain my eyes to see the road. "Over there, do you see that?" I suddenly shouted, my eyes fixed on a faint white figure in the rain. Helen didn't respond. I turned to see her sitting motionless, her eyes vacant as if she were in a trance. Her face was pale, her expression full of fear, sending chills down my spine. "Helen, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling, but she remained silent, staring straight ahead as if witnessing something terrifying. A sense of dread washed over me, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness and limited visibility intensified my panic. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind couldn't shake the image of the white figure. Suddenly, I lost control. The SUV skidded on the slippery road and crashed into a tree by the roadside. The impact was loud and jarring, and everything went black. When I came to, I found myself in a bright white hospital room, the ceiling lights blinding. A dull headache made me wince. "She's awake," a voice called out. A nurse entered, her face kind but concerned. "Do you remember what happened?" she asked gently. I just remember driving in the forest, and then," I replied, my voice hoarse. "You and your friend are very lucky. A ranger found you both unconscious and brought you here in time," the nurse explained. I tried to sit up, but the dizziness lingered. "What about Helen? Where is she?" I asked, my voice full of worry. The nurse hesitated before answering. "Your friend Helen has woken up but suffered a severe leg injury. She's been very quiet since she woke up. We are monitoring her condition." My heart sank. Helen had always been strong, but now she seemed so vulnerable. I told myself I needed to be strong for her, to support her through this difficult time. "Can I see her?" I asked, my voice filled with concern. The nurse nodded. Yes, but you need to rest a bit more before you move. We'll take you to Helen's room when you feel better. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself. The image of the white figure in the rain and Helen's terrified face kept replaying in my mind. What had happened in that forest? Why was Helen so deeply affected? These questions swirled in my thoughts, leaving me restless and uneasy. After a few hours of rest, I felt better and was guided by the nurse to Helen's room. Her hospital room was at the end of the hallway, with weak light filtering through the windows, making the space feel even colder. I walked in and saw Helen lying on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, her face still etched with fear. "Helen," I called softly, walking to her bedside. She turned to look at me, her eyes sunken, her face exhausted. "I want to go home," Helen said, her voice weak but resolute. Understanding my friend's state of mind, I didn't blame her. We had gone through a terrifying ordeal. "All right, I'll take you home," I replied, squeezing her hand, trying to offer comfort and reassurance. I stepped outside and asked the nurse if we could be discharged immediately. The nurse nodded and said, "Yes, but you will need to change her bandages and disinfect her wound for a week. We will provide everything you need." "I'll do it," I agreed without hesitation. As long as Helen felt safe and comfortable, I was willing to do anything. After completing the paperwork, the nurse showed me how to change the bandages and care for Helen's wound. They provided us with a small medical kit and detailed instructions. I packed everything and returned to Helen's room, helping her sit up and get ready to leave. Despite the lingering pain and fatigue, I knew I had to be stronger. I supported Helen as we left the hospital, walking slowly under the still overcast sky after the heavy rain. The taxi waiting outside took us back to our apartment in the city outskirts. Throughout the ride, Helen remained silent, her eyes still haunted by fear and memories. I held her hand, hoping to make her feel less alone and scared. When we arrived at the apartment, I helped Helen sit down on the sofa and prepared a cup of hot tea. "You rest? I'll take care of everything," I said, trying to do everything possible to make Helen feel comfortable. Helen just nodded, her eyes distant. I knew that the incident in the forest had left a deep mark on her mind, but I believed that together we could overcome these haunting memories. I sat down beside Helen, holding her hand tightly, and we both sank into silence, searching for peace after the storm. Helen, my best friend, wasn't just a cheerful girl. She also harbored a lot of loneliness inside. From a young age, she had to cope with her parents' divorce, leading her to live independently in the suburbs. Since she wasn't yet 18, Helen still received financial support from her mother to cover her living expenses. Her father almost never contacted her, and the memories of him in Helen's mind were gradually fading. Occasionally, I overheard Helen talking to her mother on the phone. Although the conversations were brief, the tone and responses from her mother conveyed indifference and a lack of concern. Helen's mother had a new family and a stepchild, and it seemed she no longer had much time or affection for Helen. Once, after finishing a phone call with her mother, Helen sat quietly by the window, gazing out into the distant sky. "I always feel like I don't belong anywhere," she sighed, her eyes heavy with sadness. "My mom has a new life, and I'm just an insignificant part of it." Those words made me appreciate and cherish Helen even more. Despite having to face many difficulties on her own, she always appeared cheerful, strong, and knew how to bring joy to others. Helen's resilience and optimistic nature were a great source of inspiration for me. I remember one time when we both sat by the lake, the sunset reflecting on the water. Helen shared her dream of traveling the world, exploring new places, and finding her own happiness. "One day, we'll travel together, won't we?" She smiled, her eyes sparkling with hope. "Definitely, Helen. We'll travel everywhere and experience the most wonderful things together," I replied, feeling a warmth in my heart. Those moments, along with the stories and confidences Helen shared, helped me understand and love her even more. Helen was not just a close friend, but someone I always wanted to protect and share every joy and sorrow in life with. We had overcome many challenges together, and I believed we would continue to stand by each other, seeking joy and happiness in the future. After returning home, I knew I had to change Helen's bandages and take care of her wounds. However, as soon as we stepped inside, Helen quickly ran upstairs. Our house had 2 floors, and Helen lived on the upper floor. "No need, I can do it myself," she said, her voice resolute. From that day on, Helen seemed completely different. She avoided me and rarely went outside. Even though I wanted to be there to care for and support her, work and studies kept me from always being present. Day by day, Helen became more distant. We barely spoke after that fateful day. One time, as I was getting ready for work, Helen suddenly said something cryptic. "You should cover all the mirrors in the house at night." Her words puzzled me, but in my rush, I didn't dwell on them. Then, another day, when I came home from school, I noticed the food I left on the table spoiled quickly, even though it was in the fridge. Fruits left out for just a short while would rot. These incidents were strange and inexplicable, but the hustle and bustle of work and school made me not pay much attention to them. Occasionally, Helen would say odd things that made me question my best friend. She seemed to live in her own world, completely detached from reality. I wanted to ask her more, to understand what had happened to Helen, but every time I approached her, she would find a way to evade me. I recalled the happy and warm memories we had shared, feeling regret for this change. Helen used to bring joy and warmth to my life, but now she had become a mystery, a constant worry in my heart. Despite this, life went on, pulling me along with daily responsibilities and pressures. I kept telling myself that I would find out more about Helen's change when I had time, but there always seemed to be something in the way. The distance between us grew, and I didn't know if I could bridge that gap. But deep down, I always hoped that one day Helen would return to her old self and we would face all our challenges together again. One night while I was sleeping, a slight noise downstairs woke me up. It was around 1 a.m. In the dim light cast by the street lamp outside, I saw Helen coming downstairs. Not believing my eyes, I squinted to see more clearly. Helen, my beautiful friend, had completely changed. She was gaunt and pale to an unbelievable extent, as if the life had been drained from her body. My heart pounded faster, anxiety rising within me. "Helen, are you okay?" I asked, sitting up, my voice unable to hide the worry. Helen remained silent, not responding. She paused for a moment, then continued to walk upstairs. But something was very strange. She wasn't walking normally, but on tiptoes, trying not to make any noise. Each of Helen's steps was filled with caution, as if she was trying to avoid something or someone. A sense of dread enveloped me. I felt that something was terribly wrong. I couldn't let this worry torment me any longer. I decided that I would have a clear conversation with Helen the next morning. I needed to know what had happened to her and why she had changed so much. But that night, I couldn't get another wink of sleep. Every little sound in the house seemed magnified in my mind, making me imagine the worst. I lay there, wide-eyed, waiting for the dawn, hoping that these mysteries would soon be unraveled. The next morning, I would have to find a way to help Helen, even if it meant facing whatever was lurking in the shadows. The next morning, filled with worry and determination, I decided to contact Helen's mother. I explained in detail the strange changes in Helen, from her avoidance of me and her peculiar behavior to her unusual appearance the night before. "I think Helen needs her family's help," I said, trying to remain calm despite my inner turmoil. Helen's mother listened, her voice full of concern. "Wait, I'll come right away. My house is not far in Greenville, just about an hour's drive." That afternoon, Helen's mother arrived at our apartment along with her new husband. As she stepped inside, a strange smell filled the room, making her uneasy as well. "This room has a very strange odor," she said, her face etched with worry. She began to walk upstairs to check on Helen, but after just 3 steps, she stopped and turned back to look at me, her eyes filled with confusion. "I can't go any further," she said, her voice trembling. "It feels like something invisible is holding me back." Not wanting to give up, she called her new husband from the car to help. He stepped inside, looked around, and called out loudly, "Helen, are you up there?" But there was no response. Determined not to let the situation drag on, they both started to walk upstairs. As soon as they reached the top step, a cry echoed from above. Helen's mother cried out in pain and fear. Her cries resonated throughout the house, making my heart feel like it was being squeezed. I didn't know what awaited us up there, but it was clear that something terrible had happened to Helen. In that moment, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The mysteries and fears that I had been trying to suppress now surged back with intensity. I had to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. I couldn't abandon Helen. Couldn't let my best friend confront this alone. I decided to go upstairs, face whatever awaited, and help Helen overcome this nightmare. I walked upstairs, my heart full of anxiety and anticipation. When I saw the scene before me, my heart felt like it was being squeezed. Helen was sitting on the floor, looking haggard and pale, her mother sobbing in front of her, her voice choked with emotion. "Helen, come home with me. I'll take care of you," she pleaded, her voice full of earnestness. Helen didn't say anything, just nodded in agreement. However, there was something very strange when she tried to stand up. Helen seemed unable to move and weakly said, "I need 2 socks." Her mother seemed to understand something, hurriedly fetched 2 socks for her, and helped her put them on. When Helen began to walk toward the door, she moved in a strange manner, tiptoeing, her feet not touching the ground. I, Helen's mother, and her new stepfather followed silently, saying nothing. Suddenly, Helen collapsed, as if all her strength had left her. Her stepfather ran over, picked Helen up, and quickly carried her to the car. Helen's mother turned back to me, her voice choked with emotion, and said, "Thank you for letting me know." Then, they all got into the car and disappeared into the night. I stood there, hoping Helen would be okay, and quietly returned home to prepare for my shift at McDonald's. A month later, during a heavy downpour with thunder rumbling continuously, I found myself thinking of Helen. I picked up the phone and called Helen's mother to inquire about her current condition. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then Helen's mother started crying when I asked about Helen. "She's not herself anymore," she said, her voice full of sorrow, before hanging up. I sat there, the phone still in my hand, my heart filled with unease. The unanswered questions and worry for my best friend left me restless. What had Helen gone through? Why had she changed so much? And what awaited her in her new home? I didn't know the answers, but I hoped that Helen would find herself again, even if she had to face whatever was haunting her. In my heart, Helen was still my closest friend, someone I was always willing to help, no matter how difficult things might get. My name is John Davis, but most people call me Lion. The nickname comes from my strong, fearless nature, a necessary trait for a ranger in the vast and wild redwood forest of California. My job is to protect this forest from poachers and illegal loggers while ensuring the safety of those who wander deep into the woods. Although I've faced many dangerous situations, there was one rainy night on a Saturday weekend that made me rethink my courage. It was a gloomy and chilly evening, with rain pouring down like a waterfall. I was allowed to visit my family every weekend, but this time I decided to spend a little extra time checking the forest before heading home. The towering redwoods stretched up to the sky, creating a dark green canopy that covered the wet trail I often patrolled. The rain fell in streams on the leaves, producing a continuous murmuring sound like a somber background music. I slowly drove my patrol car towards the main road, the wheels sinking into the muddy terrain. Forest roads on rainy days like this were always difficult to navigate, but I was used to it. What worried me more were the poachers or illegal loggers who might take advantage of the bad weather to carry out their crimes without fear of being caught. As I drove through the thick curtain of rain, the headlights suddenly illuminated a vague figure ahead. It was a man walking in the forest. He stood motionless in the middle of the road, seemingly indifferent to the torrential downpour. I slowed down and stopped the car a safe distance from him. The man looked haggard and covered in mud. His face was gaunt, and his eyes were empty, almost lifeless. From my experience, I knew he might be in danger or in need of help. I stepped out of the car, shielding my head with my cap, and approached him. "What are you doing out here in the rain?" I asked, raising my voice to be heard over the sound of the rain. "Do you need help?" The man didn't answer, just stood there looking at me with a vacant stare. His silence made me uneasy, but I couldn't leave him out here. "Do you need any help? It's very dangerous in this rain." He still didn't say anything, just pointed towards a direction deep into the forest. My instincts told me something was wrong, but I decided to follow his lead. After all, my job was to protect this forest and the people in it. "All right, get in the car," I said, motioning for him to follow. "I'll take you to a safer place." The man still didn't speak, only quietly moved towards my car. I opened the door, waiting for him to get in. Although my instincts were screaming that something was off, I couldn't leave him alone in the cold, rainy forest. I started the car, preparing for whatever unexpected events might come. The man got into the car with a weary demeanor, and as soon as the door closed, the atmosphere inside the vehicle became tense and suffocating. The damp, muddy smell from the man mingled with the sound of the rain outside, creating a sense of unease. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and began to reassure him. "Hey, are you okay? Don't worry, I'll help you," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. "Can you tell me your name?" The man sat silently for a moment, his eyes still vacant, but then he seemed to snap out of it and turned to look at me. "My name is Alan," he said, his tone still very unusual, full of anxiety and fear. "Nice to meet you, Alan," I continued, trying to keep the conversation going to make him feel safer. "What happened to you? Why are you in the middle of the forest on a rainy night like this?" Alan took a deep breath, as if to calm himself before answering. "They imprisoned me," he said, his voice trembling. I frowned, not fully understanding. "They? Who imprisoned you?" "Yes, I was held captive by a group of people for a long time," Alan explained. "But one time I managed to escape and ran into this forest and..." He held his head, his face becoming panic-stricken. "And what else, Alan? What happened?" I asked, feeling my anxiety rising. Alan looked straight into my eyes, his voice filled with fear. I started encountering strange things, white shadows and supernatural entities. They are hard to believe, but they are here in this forest. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Maybe you were just too tired and imagined things, Alan. It's raining and you're under a lot of stress." "No," Alan shouted, his eyes wild. "You have to believe me. You have to believe me." "Calm down and just tell me everything," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Alan began to recount his story, his voice shaky but more detailed, each word cutting through the cold, rainy night air. "I was held in an old house, imprisoned and tortured for months. One night when they were drunk and careless, I managed to escape. I ran into the forest, pushing through thick bushes and muddy paths. The rain was pouring down, making everything more obscure and dangerous." He paused, taking a deep breath to regain his composure before continuing. "But as I ran deeper into the forest, I started to feel something was wrong. I heard whispers from the shadows of the trees, like someone was watching me. My flashlight could only illuminate a small part of the dense darkness, and every time I turned around, I saw glimpses of white shadows." Alan's voice became hoarse and more trembling. "They weren't human, John. They were supernatural entities, ghosts with hollow eyes and eerie laughter. I tried to run, but it seemed like the forest had no way out. Every path led me back to the same spot, where I saw those ghosts." I felt a cold shiver down my spine as I listened to Alan's words, but I still tried to reassure him. "Alan, maybe you were too tired and scared, so you imagined those things." "No," Alan shouted, his eyes wild. "You have to believe me. You have to believe me." Before I could react, Alan lunged at me, his hands wrapping around my neck as I was driving. His mouth kept screaming, "You have to believe me. You have to believe me." I was startled, feeling my neck being squeezed, and the car started to swerve on the muddy road. I struggled to keep control of the steering wheel while trying to pry Alan's hands off my neck. Fear engulfed me as I realized that both of our lives were in imminent danger. I felt my neck being squeezed, almost choking. In a moment of panic, I decided to stop the car, trying to push Alan away from me. The car jolted to a halt in the muddy, rainy road, and I almost tumbled out, clutching my neck to catch my breath. Alan kept screaming, "You have to believe me! I saw them! We have to leave now or we will all die!" I stepped out of the car, my hands shaking as I drew my gun from my belt and aimed it at Alan. "Stay still, or I will shoot," I warned, but Alan seemed unafraid. He kept shouting, "You have to believe me! They are here! They will kill us!" Having no other choice, I fired a shot into the air as a final warning. The gunshot echoed through the forest, but Alan still didn't stop, instead charging towards me with a crazed, panicked look in his eyes. I had to knock him out, feeling his weak resistance fade as he collapsed. I dragged Alan back into the car, carefully placing him in the back seat. With a turbulent mind, I drove straight to the police station where I reported everything that had happened. The police immediately took Alan in and began their investigation. The next day, I received a call from the police. "John, we have identified the man. He is a patient from a mental hospital and has been missing for a week," said the voice on the other end, leaving me stunned. "What did you say?" I asked, feeling my heart race. Yes, Alan escaped from the mental hospital, and we are working on getting him back. But John, you mentioned that he talked about entities and strange occurrences? I was silent for a moment, recalling Alan's panicked eyes and fearful words. Yes, he said he saw white shadows and supernatural entities in the forest. I thought he was hallucinating due to stress and fear. The police officer paused before continuing. We will investigate further, but given Alan's mental condition, it's very likely that what he said was just a hallucination. I hung up the phone, sitting quietly in my car. Although Alan's story seemed implausible, his frantic eyes and genuine fear made me unable to stop thinking. Could what he said about the entities and strange occurrences be real? The redwood forest had always been a place where I felt safe, but now it seemed more mysterious and frightening than ever. I reminded myself to be more cautious on my future patrols, not just for my own safety, but also for the mysteries waiting to be unraveled in the deep forest. The broken car. It was a stormy night, and I was driving home after a grueling day at work. The road stretched ahead, a long, dark ribbon barely illuminated by my car's headlights. The rain fell in sheets, battering the windshield with relentless force, and the wipers struggled to keep up. Fatigue weighed heavily on me, and all I wanted was to get home, slip into dry clothes, and curl up on the couch. Out of nowhere, my car began to shudder. The engine made a series of loud, unsettling noises, and the warning lights on the dashboard started flashing like a Christmas tree. My heart sank as the car lost power and coasted to a stop on the side of the road. I tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. I was stranded. I sighed and pulled out my phone, hoping to call for roadside assistance, but of course there was no signal. I was in the middle of nowhere, with the nearest town miles away. With no other options, I decided to get out and see if I could figure out what was wrong. As soon as I stepped out, the rain soaked me to the bone. I popped the hood and peered into the engine compartment, but I was no mechanic. The rain made it nearly impossible to see anything, let alone diagnose the problem. I stood there feeling increasingly helpless and exposed. Just then, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps splashing through puddles. I spun around and saw a figure emerging from the darkness, a man dressed in a black raincoat. He moved with a deliberate, almost eerie calm, his face obscured by the hood. "Hello there. Need some help?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the din of the storm. Startled, I tried to steady my nerves. Yeah, my car broke down and I can't get it to start. No phone signal either," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The man walked closer, and as he did, I could make out more of his features. He had a rugged, weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to gleam in the darkness. "Lucky for you, I'm a mechanic," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mind if I take a look?" Something about him set off alarm bells in my head. Maybe it was his sudden appearance out of nowhere, or the way his smile seemed off, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Still, I was desperate, and I reluctantly nodded. "Sure, if you think you can fix it," I said, stepping aside. The man moved to the front of the car and began inspecting the engine. I watched him closely, every instinct screaming at me to stay on guard. As the minutes ticked by, the rain continued to pour, and the man's movements seemed to grow slower and more deliberate. "So, what do you think?" I asked, trying to speed things along. He straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag. "It's hard to say in this weather. Might take a while," he replied, his eyes locking onto mine. "But don't worry, we'll get you fixed up." The way he said "we" sent a chill down my spine. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how isolated we were. No other cars had passed by, and there were no houses or buildings in sight. The darkness seemed to close in on me. "Thanks, but I think I'll call for help once I get a signal," I said, edging back towards the driver's side door. "I'll be fine." Before I could reach the door, the man's hand shot out and grabbed my arm. His grip was like iron. "I insist," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You should stay here." Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm free with all my might. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. "No, really? I appreciate it, but I have to go," I stammered, fumbling with the car door. The man's face twisted in anger, and he lunged towards me. In a blind rush of adrenaline, I managed to slam the door shut and lock it just as he reached the window. He pounded on the glass, shouting, but his words were lost in the roar of the storm. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition. Miraculously, the engine roared to life. I floored the accelerator and the car lurched forward. The man was left standing in the rain, his furious face disappearing into the darkness as I sped away. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station and sat there, shaking and soaked to the skin, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I called the police and told them everything. A few days later, I saw a news report about a man who had escaped from a nearby prison. The description matched the man I'd encountered that night. He was a dangerous criminal wanted for multiple violent offenses. I shuddered to think what might have happened if I'd stayed with him any longer. To this day, I never drive on deserted roads at night without a fully charged phone and a backup plan. And I always keep my car in top condition, so I never have to rely on the kindness of strangers in the middle of a storm. The third story ends. Rainy Diary channel invites you to listen to the fourth story. My name is Mike, and I still vividly remember that evening. I was driving through the Ravenwood Forest around 5 p.m. It was pouring rain, but I didn't mind. Sitting behind the wheel, I enjoyed my favorite music and the sound of the rain, which felt like a magical background symphony of nature. I was on my way to attend a friend's wedding, and my mood was quite cheerful. My car, an old but reliable Jeep Wrangler, smoothly navigated the muddy trails. I felt safe inside the vehicle, surrounded by the soothing sound of raindrops and the wind rustling through the leaves. Occasionally, I lowered the window to breathe in the fresh air, smelling the damp earth and vegetation, which created a pleasantly refreshing sensation. But suddenly, my car stalled. I tried restarting it, but to no avail. Frustration and annoyance washed over me, but I had no other choice but to get out of the car in the pouring rain to check the engine. I put on my raincoat, pulled up my hood, and stepped outside. The rain lashed against my face, cold and biting, but I tried to stay calm and inspect the car. After fiddling around for a while without success, I decided to call for roadside assistance. They informed me it would take about an hour to reach me. By now, it was around 7 p.m. The rain started to let up, and the forest sounds grew eerily silent. I sat in the car, opened the window to enjoy the fresh air, and waited for the tow truck. Suddenly, I heard voices nearby. It was a heated argument between two men. "You can't keep doing this, John," one voice exclaimed, filled with tension. "I know, but we have no other choice," the other man replied, sounding worried. I sensed something was wrong. I shouted, "Are you guys okay?" But immediately, everything fell silent again. I sat there, trying to comprehend what I had just heard. After about 5 minutes, I heard voices again, this time from a couple. "You don't know the way, do you? We're lost," a woman's voice yelled, filled with frustration. "I told you I knew the way," a man's voice responded, full of fear. I tried to listen more closely, but I couldn't pinpoint their location. They seemed to be in trouble. I shouted again, "Do you need help?" But once more, everything went silent, as if those voices had never existed. In the pitch-black darkness and dense forest, I felt a growing unease. Were those voices real people or just tricks played by the forest? I didn't know, but I clearly felt I was no longer alone. Fear gradually took over as the night grew darker and the sounds of insects started to rise. Sitting in the car, I began to feel uneasy. I didn't dare turn off the car's lights, fearing that the darkness would swallow me whole. Every small sound in the forest made me jump. I started to wonder if I had misheard, but the voices were so clear and intense that they couldn't be a product of my imagination. Time passed slowly, each minute feeling like an hour. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I saw the headlights of the tow truck. My heart leaped with relief as I quickly got out of the car and waved. The tow truck driver stepped out, looking calm and professional. "Sorry for the wait," he said. "I heard voices," I stammered. "There are people out there in the forest. They sounded like they were in trouble." The tow truck driver looked at me with a sympathetic but skeptical expression. "This forest is vast and often has strange sounds. But don't worry, we'll get you out of here." I didn't know if he believed me, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from there, far from those strange voices. As the tow truck pulled my Jeep Wrangler out of the forest, I looked back one last time. The dense trees seemed to want to swallow everything, and I wondered if those voices were lost souls or just nature's tricks. I didn't know, but I was sure I would never forget that terrifying night. I made it to my friend's wedding, but my mind was still haunted by what had happened. I recounted the story to a few friends, but they just laughed and said I had imagined it all. But I knew, deep down, those voices were real, and they would always remain a mystery that I couldn't explain. I've been a long-haul truck driver for over a decade, and in that time I've seen and experienced things on the road that most people wouldn't believe. But there's one story that still gives me chills every time I think about it. It happened on a stormy night a few years ago. The rain was coming down in sheets that night, drumming relentlessly against my windshield and making it almost impossible to see. I had just finished a delivery and was eager to get home. To save some time, I decided to take a shortcut through a dense forest that I knew was rarely traveled, especially at night. The forest route was quicker, but notoriously eerie, and I had heard some strange tales from other drivers about it. As I drove deeper into the forest, my headlights were barely enough to cut through the thick darkness. The trees on either side of the narrow road loomed over me, their branches swaying in the wind and casting long, menacing shadows. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof of my cab was deafening, and the wind howled through the trees, making the forest seem even more alive and sinister. I was doing my best to concentrate on the slick, winding road when I saw it, an old, rickety bridge up ahead. This bridge was the only way to cross the fast-moving river that cut through the forest. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the middle of the bridge, illuminated by my headlights, was a figure. It was a man, standing completely still in the pouring rain. He was wearing what looked like outdated clothing, and his head was bowed, his face obscured by the shadows and rain. A feeling of unease settled. I couldn't just drive past someone who might need help, especially in such a dangerous spot. I slowed my truck to a stop a few meters from the figure, turned on my hazard lights, and grabbed my flashlight before stepping out into the storm. The rain was so heavy it felt like a barrage of tiny needles hitting my face. I shouted over the roar of the storm, "Hey, do you need any help?" My voice sounded small and insignificant against the noise of the rain and wind. The man didn't move or respond. He just stood there, as if he hadn't heard me. I took a few cautious steps forward, my boots splashing in the puddles forming on the bridge. As I got closer, I could see more details. His clothes were indeed old-fashioned, and they were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Hey!" I called out again, louder this time, but still there was no reaction. The man remained motionless, his head still bowed. A sense of dread began to build in my chest. I was only a few feet away now, and I could see his face more clearly. Or rather, I should have been able to see it, but his features were indistinct, almost blurry, like looking at a photo out of focus. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something was very wrong. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to get out of there as fast as I could. But I had to know. I had to be sure that this was real. I reached out a hand, my fingers trembling, and as I was about to touch his shoulder, he lifted his head. His eyes were the first thing I noticed. They were dark, empty voids, devoid of any life or light. His mouth opened, and he let out a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the entire forest. It was a sound of pure despair and torment, and it chilled me to the bone. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The man took a step forward, and as he did, he began to fade, his form becoming more transparent with each passing second. I blinked, and suddenly he was gone, vanished into the rain and darkness as if he had never been there at all. I stood there, drenched and shaking, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The bridge was empty now, the only sound, the relentless rain and the river rushing below. I didn't know how long I stood there before my survival instincts kicked back in, urging me to get back to my truck. I climbed back into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I took a few deep breaths, trying to steady myself. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but none came. All I knew was that I had to get out of that forest as fast as possible. I started the truck and drove off the bridge, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirrors, half expecting to see the ghostly figure standing there again. But the road behind me remained empty. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on a main road, that I began to feel a semblance of safety. When I finally got home, I was still in a state of shock. I told my wife what had happened, but she just looked at me with a mixture of concern and skepticism. She suggested I might have been overtired or stressed, and maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I had seen. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the experience. I did some research and discovered that many years ago, a man had indeed jumped from that very bridge in a storm similar to the one I had driven through. His body was never found, swept away by the river's current. Local legends said his spirit still haunted the bridge, appearing to travelers during storms. I haven't taken that shortcut since. Even now, whenever I drive through a stormy night, I can't help but feel a chill when I think of the ghost on the bridge. There are things in this world we can't explain, and sometimes it's best to leave them alone. The strange light. It was a torrentially rainy night, and I was driving home after a long, exhausting day at work. The road cutting through the forest had become familiar to me after many years of commuting on it, but on a rainy night like this, everything seemed more blurred and mysterious than ever. The heavy raindrops pounded against the windshield, creating a continuous thudding sound, and the wipers worked at full capacity, yet still couldn't completely clear the thick veil of rain. While focusing on the road ahead, I suddenly saw a strange light emanating from within the forest. That light didn't resemble car headlights, nor did it look like a flashlight or house light. It was a pale blue, ethereal glow coming from a deep point within the forest. I felt almost hypnotized by the light, and curiosity drove me to pull over by the roadside to investigate. I turned off the engine, grabbed the flashlight from the car, and stepped out. The rain poured down, drenching me within seconds. I pulled my jacket collar up and shone the flashlight in the direction of the light, starting to walk. Each step squelched through rainwater and mud, and I felt cold and slightly frightened, but curiosity spurred me on. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the blue light became clearer. It looked like a glowing orb, hovering in midair, emitting a soft but mesmerizing light. I moved closer, feeling almost enchanted by this strange sight. But as I approached the light, it abruptly went out, leaving me standing in complete darkness. My heart pounded, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I swept the flashlight around, but saw nothing except thick trees and heavy rain. An eerie silence enveloped me, with only the sound of falling rain and my own ragged breathing. I decided to head back to the car. Turning around, I noticed my footprints were being washed away by the rain, but there were also other footprints, larger and deeper, leading in the opposite direction. Terrified, I ran back towards my car, feeling as if someone was watching me from the shadows. When I got back to the car, I saw the driver's door wide open and the interior lights flickering. I was sure I had locked the door before leaving. My heart racing, I checked inside the car and found my belongings scattered. My wallet and phone were still there, but there were muddy footprints on the seats and floor mats. Someone had been in my car while I was in the forest. I quickly shut the door, locked it tight, and started the engine. The car started reluctantly, and I sped away from there, not daring to look back. The entire drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange light and the intruder who had broken into my car. That night, when I got home, I locked all the doors and checked all the windows. The image of the eerie blue light and the feeling of being watched in the forest kept replaying in my mind. I sat down on the sofa, trying to calm down, but couldn't shake off the fear and unease. Even though I was safe at home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I wondered what that light was and why it disappeared when I got close. Who had broken into my car, and what did they want? My mind was filled with unanswered questions. In the following days, I tried to return to my normal routine, but that night haunted me. Every time I drove through the forest at night, I always felt like eyes were watching me from the darkness. I told a few friends about the incident, but they just laughed and said I had imagined it all because I was too tired. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. Since then, I've always avoided driving through the forest at night, especially on rainy nights. I didn't want to encounter that strange light or the feeling of being watched ever again. On rainy nights, I often sat by the window, looking out into the night, wondering if there was something still waiting for me in the darkness of that forest. The sixth story ends. Rainy Diary Channel invites you to listen to the seventh story, The Endless Rain. This summer, I decided to embark on a road trip through the majestic northern forests and mountains. It was a chance to escape the stress of work and immerse myself in nature. However, what I had anticipated as a refreshing journey turned into a nightmare I could never forget. After leaving a small town, I followed winding trails leading deep into the forested mountains. It started with a light drizzle as I ventured deeper into the dense forest, but I wasn't too worried since the weather forecast had only mentioned occasional showers. The rain began to pour harder as I drove along the winding roads. Nevertheless, I had come well prepared with all the necessary gear, from raincoats and flashlights to food and water. The sky grew darker and the downpour became more intense. Heavy raindrops pounded the windshield, reducing my visibility to just a few meters. I decided to find a place to take shelter for the night and continue my journey in the morning. However, finding shelter in the dense forest during such a heavy rain was no easy task. As I navigated a steep, gravelly road, my car began to skid and lurch. The road grew muddier and more treacherous. I tried to remain calm, focusing on driving through the challenging terrain. However, I soon realized I had ventured into a completely unfamiliar area. Every time I thought I had found an exit, the road led me deeper into the forest. By now, it was past midnight. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and it felt like it would last forever. Rainwater started seeping into the car, making everything damp and chilly. I decided to stop for a moment to rest and think about my next steps. But as I turned off the engine and sat quietly in the car, I began hearing strange noises from outside. The rain drummed incessantly on the roof, but there were also faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to listen carefully, but the rain was too loud, making everything sound muffled. I turned on my flashlight and shone it out the window, but all I could see were blurred tree silhouettes in the thick rain. Determined not to stay idle, I opened the map and GPS on my phone to find a way out. Strangely, my GPS had no signal at all, and the map was of no help in this situation. I felt like I was trapped in an endless space with no way out. Trying to stay calm, I decided to keep driving, hoping to find another road. But after several hours of driving in vain, I realized I was going in circles. Every turn I took seemed to lead me back to the same point. Panic started to take over my mind. In my desperation, I saw the faint glow of lights from a small house by the roadside. I decided to stop and go inside to seek help. The house looked old and abandoned, but I had no other choice. When I stepped inside, I found everything covered in dust and mold. There were no signs of life. I ventured further into the house, looking for a phone or anything that could help me contact the outside world. As I entered the living room, I was startled by a large mirror hanging on the wall. In the dim light, my reflection in the mirror looked strange. My face appeared weary and much older than it should have been. Suddenly, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned around, but saw no one. My heart pounded, and I tried to stay calm as I made my way back to the car. But as soon as I stepped outside, I realized the house had disappeared, leaving only an empty plot of land and darkness. At this moment, I knew I was trapped in a real nightmare. The rain continued to pour, and the road leading into the forest seemed endless. I drove aimlessly, hoping to find a way out of this terrifying forest. The next day, the rain still poured down heavily. Exhausted, I began to feel the symptoms of dehydration and lack of sleep. Just then, I saw another car approaching from a distance. Filled with hope, I waved frantically for it to stop. As it got closer, I realized it was a police car. The officers stepped out and asked what had happened. I recounted the entire story in a state of panic. They listened attentively and told me to get into their car so they could lead me out of the forest. On the way out, they mentioned that many people had gone missing in this forest during heavy rains. They couldn't explain why the rain seemed to last forever. Finally, I escaped that horrific forest. But the story of the endless rain and the strange occurrences I experienced still haunt me. I'll never forget the feeling of being trapped in an endless loop, and the eerie whispers in the forest rain. Every night, working with my taxi, I usually encountered many different customers. But one rainy night, I met a strange passenger who completely changed my life. That evening, the rain was pouring down. The streets were deserted and wet, with only the streetlights shimmering in the rain. I was about to end my shift early because of the bad weather when I saw a man standing in the rain, waving for a taxi. He was dressed in black from head to toe, with a fedora hat covering his face. I stopped the car, opened the door, and he got in, bringing with him the chill of the rainy night. "Take me to the edge of the forest," he said in a deep, hoarse voice, his eyes hidden under the hat. I felt something was off, but still decided to take him. The road to the edge of the forest was quite far, and the deeper we went into the deserted road, the colder and more oppressive the atmosphere became. When we arrived, he asked me to wait. "Don't turn off the engine, wait for me here," he said, then opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the rainy night. I watched as his silhouette vanished among the dense trees, a sense of unease rising within me. Sitting in the car, I could hear the rain pattering on the roof, feeling as though time was passing very slowly. About 20 minutes later, I started to hear strange sounds coming from the forest. They were whispers, initially soft but gradually becoming clearer and more eerie. "Did you see anything?" A voice from behind the car startled me. I turned around but saw no one. At this point, I was really panicking, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The whispers continued, sounding like someone arguing, one voice angry, the other trembling and scared. I rolled down the window and called out loudly, "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" But there was no response, only the sound of rain and the wind whistling through the trees. Suddenly, the car's engine died, plunging everything into silence. I tried to restart it, but to no avail. The car remained motionless. At that moment, I remembered the radio in the car. I turned it on and called the dispatch center, but received only silence in return. The radio was dead too, its battery drained. Left alone in the rainy night, I felt completely isolated. The whispers began again, this time clearer. "Don't do it. I know you're better than this." The voice was filled with tension and fear. I could no longer keep my composure, deciding to step out of the car to search for the strange passenger. I ventured deeper into the forest, following the direction I thought he had gone. But the farther I went, the more the voices seemed to recede, as if they were luring me deeper into the woods. The eerie silence was overwhelming, broken only by the rain falling on the leaves. After a while, I realized I was lost. The dense forest and darkness enveloped everything, and I no longer knew the way back to the car. Panic surged within me, but I didn't dare stop. I kept moving, hoping to find some trace of the passenger. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, tearing through the silence. My heart pounded, and I hid behind a bush, trying to listen. Could that gunshot be related to the strange passenger? Or was I facing another danger in the forest? I continued forward and abruptly saw a trail of blood on the ground. I followed it, horrified to discover a shallow grave, freshly dug. Inside was a skeleton of a man, with a clear bullet wound in the chest. The strange thing was, the skeleton had been buried for many years. I stood still, trying to comprehend what was happening. The gunshot I heard earlier could have been the trace of a recent crime, or a warning from a distant past. I felt a chill down my spine, realizing I was standing before a horrifying mystery. Suddenly I heard the sound of an off-road vehicle in the distance. It was my colleagues from the dispatch center coming to help. I ran to the road and met them, recounting everything. The next morning, we, along with the police, returned to the scene to search the forest. The story ended with no clear explanation. I still wondered if the gunshot that night was real or just an illusion. And the strange passenger, who was he and where did he go? It all remained a terrifying and eerie mystery. The Silent Storm, a highway nightmare. Long-haul driving is always a challenging job, but it also gives me a sense of freedom that few other jobs can offer. That day, I had accepted a delivery from the city to a small central province. It was already getting dark when I left the city, and the rain began to pour heavily. This season's rain always came suddenly, without warning, making the roads slippery and difficult to navigate. I had been driving for over 4 hours, winding through the mountainous roads, and finally reached the highway. The comforting feeling of driving on a straight, wide road helped me forget the fatigue and tension of the treacherous curves earlier. Inside the truck's cabin, the sound of rain hitting the windshield combined with the gentle music from the radio made me feel more at ease. This delivery wasn't urgent, so I could drive leisurely without having to push myself to speed up. On the highway, the headlights of other vehicles flickered in the rain, creating long, blurry streaks of light. I maintained a steady speed, eyes focused on the road and hands firmly on the steering wheel. Everything seemed stable until I saw a faint shadow ahead. I hit the brakes and swerved slightly to avoid it, but suddenly the tires slipped on the wet road. The truck lost control, and I felt my heart drop out of my chest. The truck spun, sliding across the slippery road. I tried to regain control, but to no avail. It continued to skid and finally crashed hard into the guardrail. The impact was so strong that my head hit the steering wheel, my vision blurred, and my ears rang. In an instant, everything became hazy, and I felt pain all over my body. When I came to, I found myself slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling down my face from a cut on my forehead. I tried to open the car door to get out, but it was jammed shut. Outside, the rain kept pouring, and water flowed through the broken window, making me shiver. I took out my phone to call for help, but in my panic, my hands trembled and I couldn't dial the number. After a few tries, I finally managed to call and report my situation. They said it would take about an hour to reach me because the area was quite remote and the rain was heavy. I hung up and waited in anxiety, trying to stay calm. The pain from my injuries made me uncomfortable, and the constant rain only added to my stress. While waiting, I started hearing strange noises around me. At first, it was a faint tapping on the truck's body, as if someone was trying to knock on the door. I looked around but saw no one, just darkness and rain. Then, there were indistinct whispers, as if someone was talking nearby. The whispering voices were unclear, but enough to send chills down my spine. I tried to listen more closely, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Fear began to engulf me, and I felt like I was about to cry. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the murky night. I felt like dozens of eyes were watching me from the darkness. My heart pounded, my hands shook, and I began to wonder if I was dreaming. But it was all too real, too vivid to be just a dream. Suddenly, a loud roar echoed from deep within the dark night, powerful and authoritative. The roar silenced everything in a frightening manner. No more whispers, no more rain, just absolute silence. I sat in the truck, not daring to move, feeling as if the whole world had come to a standstill. In that eerie silence, I started to feel that something was very wrong. I decided to leave the truck and find another place to take shelter. But when I opened the door, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. Standing right in the middle of the road was a large black bear, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. The bear stared at me, assessing me. Its fur was soaked with rain, with water droplets running down its glossy black coat. My heart raced, and I realized that the bear was getting closer. It wasn't just standing there. It was crouching down, preparing to attack. At that moment, I knew that if I didn't do something, I would become its dinner. I remembered that bears could be scared off by loud noises and bright lights, but I had nothing on hand to do that. I turned back to the cabin, desperately searching for something useful. All I found was a small flashlight and the truck's alarm horn. I turned on the flashlight, shining it directly into the bear's eyes, and simultaneously pressed the alarm horn. The shrill sound pierced the night, breaking the silence. The bear stopped, staring at the blinding light, then took a few steps back. I didn't dare breathe heavily. I just kept pressing the horn and shining the light at it. Finally, the bear turned and ran into the forest, disappearing into the thick rain. I slumped back into the seat, my hands still trembling. The radio crackled to life with the voices of the rescue team, informing me that they were almost there. When the headlights of the rescue vehicles appeared in the darkness, I knew I was safe. The rescuers helped me out of the truck and checked my condition. I told them what had happened, but they just looked at me with disbelief. On the way back, I looked back at the accident scene and saw that the bear had vanished as if it had never existed. My story became an unsolved mystery, and I knew I would never forget that night. The night I faced horror on the highway and nearly became prey for a wild bear. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's story. Don't forget to subscribe to Rainy Diaries for more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.